The moment he told me to sleep in the guest room, a cold wave of disbelief washed over me, sharper than any argument we had ever had. I stood frozen in the doorway of our bedroom, my heart hammering against my ribs as if trying to escape the sudden, hollow realization of how invisible I had become. I had been his wife for over 7 years, yet tonight, in our own home, I felt like a stranger. "It's better this way," he said, his voice casual, almost dismissive, like he was giving me a simple household instruction rather than crushing the last shred of dignity I had left. I forced a nod, swallowing the lump in my throat, my fingers clutching the edge of the bedspread as if holding on to something tangible in a sea of rejection. As I carried my small overnight bag down the hallway, every step echoed the countless times I had been sidelined, ignored, or quietly humiliated. I remembered the subtle jabs, the jokes at my expense during dinner parties, the whispered compliments he gave to other women while I smiled politely, nodding along. There had been 1,000 tiny betrayals, each one soft enough to be dismissed. But together, they had formed an insidious pattern of neglect. I had chosen patience, rationalizing that wealth came with its own set of eccentricities, that love could withstand arrogance. But tonight, it felt like all those rationalizations had been stripped away, leaving me raw and exposed. I sank onto the guest bed, feeling the cool sheets beneath me, their unfamiliar stiffness mirroring the distance he had built over time. The walls around me seemed to close in, pressing against memories of laughter that had long since faded, of shared dreams that had quietly disintegrated under the weight of his ego. My mind flicked back to last year's summer gala, where he had proudly hosted a party for the city's elite while I stood in a corner, unnoticed, offering a toast no one acknowledged. I had laughed, played the role expected of me, but the sting of invisibility had burrowed deeper each time. Even now, as I lay in solitude, I could almost feel the ghost of that night, the glittering dresses, the champagne flutes, and the way his hand casually brushed against another woman's back as if I didn't exist. The guest room, with its sterile decor and carefully arranged furniture, only amplified the contrast. The life I was promised, the one I had imagined when we first married, felt like someone else's story now. I was present but irrelevant, living in the shadows of his wealth and social dominance. I thought about all the nights I had silently endured his late arrivals, his dismissive remarks about my career, and the unspoken hierarchy that dictated our home. And tonight, in a house meant to be shared, I was reminded with brutal clarity that I had no real place in it. Looking out the window, I glimpsed the lights from his ongoing party in the backyard, the laughter and music spilling into the night. Guests dressed in glittering gowns and tailored suits danced and mingled, oblivious to the silent figure staring from the darkened guest room. The sharp pang of FOMO hit me then, a reminder not just of his disregard but of how easily I could be replaced, how invisible I had become despite all I had given. It wasn't just a party. It was a declaration of his world, one in which I had no voice, no status, and no relevance. Yet, even as the cold realization sank in, a spark flickered inside me. Quiet, simmering, but unmistakable. I felt a seed of defiance, a pulse of clarity that whispered, "This isn't the end. This can't be all there is." For the first time in a long while, the humiliation was undeniable, but so was the knowledge that I could, eventually, reclaim the power that had been stripped away. I lay back on the stiff sheets, letting the night's chill seep into my bones, and thought about the years of silent suffering, the invisible wounds that had gone unnoticed, and the life that had been waiting for me beyond his arrogance. And somewhere deep down, behind the hurt and the sting of FOMO, I realized that this cold welcome might just be the first step toward something much bigger, something that would make him, and everyone who had dismissed me, truly regret ever underestimating me. Morning light filtered through the narrow blinds of the guest room, soft and unwelcoming, illuminating the space that had become my new reality. Each day began the same way, silently, alone, and painfully aware of my invisibility. I made my coffee in the kitchenette, careful not to disturb the household staff bustling about for his convenience, and sat by the small table, staring at my reflection in the window glass. The face looking back at me was the same one I had always known, but lately it felt like a stranger, someone who had been quietly erased from the life she once imagined. I thought of all I had sacrificed for this marriage. I had left behind my career, the one that gave me purpose and independence, to support his ventures and ensure that the household ran perfectly. I had listened to his endless discussions about investments and social strategy, nodding along while shelving my own ambitions. I had covered for his mistakes, smoothed over family conflicts, and kept secrets that were never mine to carry, all in the name of loyalty. And now none of it seemed to matter. My devotion had been invisible, my sacrifices unacknowledged, my presence reduced to the confines of a sterile guest room. When I spoke to friends, their concern was palpable. "You don't deserve this," one said, her voice trembling with worry. Another insisted I needed to stand up for myself. I smiled politely, letting their words wash over me, but inside, frustration coiled tighter with each conversation. It wasn't just his dismissal that hurt. It was the slow, accumulating weight of being consistently overlooked, minimized, and undervalued. Every word of encouragement from my friends felt both comforting and painful, a reminder that my life in the public eye was non-existent while his world thrived around me. I couldn't help but contrast our lives. He was hosting opulent brunches, traveling to exotic locales, and receiving accolades from business partners, while I remained confined, eating in solitude, my presence reduced to a shadow of his extravagance. The disparity was sharp and undeniable, and it gnawed at me, feeding a growing bitterness that simmered beneath polite smiles. I felt like a spectator in a life I had once hoped to share equally, watching from behind an invisible curtain as he flaunted the wealth and respect I had helped him accumulate. Even the smallest gestures highlighted the divide. The staff attended to his every whim, presenting breakfast trays, ironing shirts, and arranging his schedule, while my needs were a secondary afterthought. The walls around me seemed to mock my quiet desperation, their pristine emptiness reflecting the emotional void I had long ignored. Nights were the hardest. He would return late, often intoxicated with laughter from dinner parties or business dinners, and I would lie awake listening to echoes of his life, a life that no longer included me in any meaningful way. Yet amid the isolation, a spark of awareness began to flicker. I realized how much control I had unknowingly surrendered, how much influence I had buried under years of dutiful compliance. The contrast between his public adoration and my private neglect stung, but it also clarified a truth I had avoided. If I continued living invisibly, I would remain powerless. That thought, raw and urgent, began to stir something I had suppressed, a quiet, determined resolve. The humiliation and solitude were suffocating, yes, but they were also an awakening, a moment where I began to understand the stakes and the possibility of reclaiming the power that had been so casually taken from me. For now, I endured, sipping my coffee, making polite conversation with friends, and watching his life unfold from behind the walls of the guest room. But beneath the quiet desperation, a plan was forming, sharp and patient, waiting for the moment when the balance of power would shift. And when it did, I knew he wouldn't see it coming. It happened during one of his elaborate dinners, the kind where the city's elite clustered around long tables, glasses clinking and laughter floating over the ornate dining room. I had arrived early, hoping to blend into the background, to keep myself invisible as usual. But he didn't even acknowledge my presence, speaking over me, smiling at colleagues and acquaintances as if I were furniture rather than his wife. The final straw came when he made a joke about me, calling me overly sentimental and useless in front of his peers. A polite laugh followed from the table, but it landed like a weight on my chest, each chuckle pressing harder on the humiliation I had felt for years. I forced a smile, nodding along, but my mind was racing. Every slight, every dismissed opinion, every invisible hour of support and sacrifice flashed through my memory. I remembered the meetings I had attended silently, the financial advice he took only when convenient, the social events where my presence was ornamental. All those years of patience, tolerance, and quiet endurance suddenly felt meaningless, a string of ignored sacrifices that had cemented my invisibility. Anger, raw and steady, began to simmer beneath my carefully composed exterior. I excused myself under the pretense of fetching a drink, retreating to the quieter corner of the room. My hands shook slightly, not from fear but from the intensity of my growing resolve. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest, the one that came when injustice collided with endurance. I replayed his words in my head, dissected the smirk on his face, and realized something profound. For years, I had allowed him to underestimate me completely. He thought he controlled everything, including me, but he had never seen the storm gathering silently in the background. As I poured water into a glass, I considered the moral dilemma that had haunted me for months. Should I continue to endure, keep my head down, and hope that loyalty and patience would someday earn recognition? Or was this the moment to take bold action, to finally reclaim the respect and power that had been denied to me? The thought of confronting him directly terrified me, but the alternative, continued invisibility, another night of silent erasure, was unbearable. Every fiber of my being screamed that passive endurance was no longer an option. I had to act, to ensure he knew that the person he had belittled for years was capable of far more than he could imagine. My gaze wandered around the room, noting the laughter, the gleaming jewelry, the whispered gossip, the social hierarchies in full display. I felt a sharp pang of FOMO, not the shallow kind that came from missing parties, but a deep, resonant ache for the life I had been denied. The recognition, the respect, the voice that had been silenced. And yet within that pang, a subtle power emerged. If he thought I was powerless, if he assumed I would continue to accept invisibility, then he had laid the perfect foundation for my eventual reversal. I returned to the table with measured composure, each step deliberate, my mind racing with possibilities. My anger no longer felt like a wildfire consuming me. It had transformed into something strategic, precise, and quietly terrifying. I realized that every slight, every laugh at my expense, every FOMO-inducing moment he had orchestrated would now serve as fuel for my ascent. That night, as I lay in the guest room again, the familiar chill of isolation wrapping around me, I felt something I hadn't in years: clarity. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, a ruthless understanding that I could no longer be dismissed, ignored, or underestimated. For the first time, the guest room felt like the perfect vantage point, not a place of exile, but a launch pad. I closed my eyes, letting the simmering anger settle into a quiet, calculated determination, knowing that the next steps I took would change everything. The days that followed my breaking point were quiet on the surface, but turbulent beneath. I moved through the house like a shadow, listening, observing, and mentally mapping every detail of his world. Every conversation he had, every meeting I overheard, became a puzzle piece I carefully collected. I started keeping notes, small, innocuous scribbles in a notebook no one would suspect, tracking his financial dealings, his social obligations, the people who were indispensable to his empire, and the ones who could be swayed. It felt like learning a language I had always spoken in silence but never fully understood. Flashbacks intruded constantly, a montage of subtle injustices he had imposed over the years. I remembered the charity gala, where he had praised his assistant's ideas while dismissing mine in front of the board. I thought of family gatherings where he ensured my opinions were ignored, my achievements minimized, my presence ornamental. Each memory was a reminder of how long I had endured, how cleverly he had conditioned me to accept invisibility, and how deep the resentment had been buried inside me. But now, those memories were no longer sources of shame. They were fuel. I began to imagine the reversal, the moment when the tables would turn. I pictured him standing in front of his colleagues, unaware that I held the leverage he had never considered, feeling the shock ripple across his carefully curated world. I imagined the public gasps, the whispered astonishment, the subtle satisfaction that would surge through me as he realized he had underestimated me all along. The mental rehearsal became a private ritual, a careful blueprint for the moment when humiliation would shift from me to him. One evening, I called my closest friend, someone who had quietly witnessed my frustration for years. "I can't keep being invisible," I said, my voice low but steady. "I need to make him see me, really see me. But I need it to matter, legally, socially, emotionally." My friend paused, and then offered insight I had almost overlooked. You've got to be careful. He's underestimated you, yes, but the real power will come from precision, from knowing exactly which pieces to move. Don't just react, plan. Play the long game. That advice resonated deeply, crystallizing my chaotic thoughts into strategy. I started assembling a mental ledger of allies and obstacles. Which relatives were indifferent, which friends could be leveraged for information, which colleagues respected me quietly but would hesitate to speak out. Every detail mattered. The timing of a social announcement, the weight of his reputation among peers, the vulnerabilities he had left exposed. I envisioned each piece as part of a larger chessboard, and for the first time, I felt like I was playing instead of being played. Even in solitude, I practiced my approach, whispering phrases, imagining conversations, rehearsing reactions. I mapped the trajectory of the eventual confrontation, considering every possible outcome, every nuance of his public and private persona. The anger that had surged at the dinner now simmered into something precise and controlled. A tactical force waiting for the perfect moment. By the time I returned to the guest room that night, I no longer felt powerless. The humiliation of invisibility had shifted. It had become the quiet preparation for the moment he would regret underestimating me. Seeds of rebellion had been planted, watered with memories, anger, and clarity, and I could feel them beginning to grow into something unstoppable, something that would turn every slight and every act of disregard into leverage. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years it felt entirely mine to command. I began moving through the world in a way that felt almost invisible, yet profoundly liberating. At social gatherings, I stayed on the periphery, quietly observing, listening, and gathering information, all while he basked in the attention he craved. I smiled politely when acquaintances praised his accomplishments or commented on his charm. But behind the courteous nods, I was taking careful mental notes, tracking loyalties, noting opportunities, and silently cataloging his weaknesses. Each subtle maneuver, each quiet act of observation, felt like reclaiming a small piece of the power I had long been denied. There were evenings when I attended charity events or gallery openings, deliberately under the radar, dressed simply while he flaunted extravagance. I could see him from across the room, shaking hands with influential figures, laughing at jokes I had once been forced to laugh at, taking the stage in conversations that should have included me. And yet, in my quiet, deliberate absence from the spotlight, I felt a strange exhilaration. For the first time, I was acting on my own terms, no longer performing for his approval, no longer bending to his world. The tension in my chest coexisted with a growing sense of control, a quiet, steady empowerment that whispered, "They see me now, even if they don't know it." I began testing small reversals, subtle ways to challenge his assumptions without drawing attention. A compliment withheld, a carefully phrased disagreement, a suggestion offered in private to mutual acquaintances that contradicted his narrative. Each small act carried weight, forcing him to reconsider what he thought he knew about me. Internally, I felt my confidence grow alongside the tension that built with each calculated move. I was no longer the invisible wife. I was a quiet force, moving through his carefully constructed world, challenging it without ever needing to confront it head-on. Then came the second FOMO moment. I happened to pass by the balcony where he was entertaining guests, throwing yet another extravagant party. The glittering lights, the flowing champagne, the laughter and admiration, everything he flaunted so easily, hit me with a familiar pang. For a moment, I felt the old sting of exclusion, the ache of being overlooked while he reveled in wealth and status. But this time, it was different. Instead of despair, it ignited something sharper. I realized that all this extravagance, all his flaunting, was a blind spot. He was so absorbed in proving his success that he hadn't noticed I was quietly accumulating leverage, observing, and planning. That evening, as I returned to my guest room, I reflected on the small victories I had claimed in the shadows. I had, not yet struck directly, but every understated move, every silent observation, and every carefully placed word built toward something far larger. The quiet empowerment I felt was intoxicating. yet I remained acutely aware of the tension coiling beneath it. I was invisible to him, yes, but in that invisibility, I had freedom, and with freedom came strategy. By the time I lay down that night, I felt the contrast between his visible, ostentatious life and my quiet, calculated existence more keenly than ever. Where he flaunted wealth without awareness, I nurtured influence with intention. The tension was no longer fear, it was anticipation, a steady pulse of energy that promised that when the time came, the world he had so carefully curated would no longer be his alone. And somewhere in the quiet shadows of my life, I felt the first true thrill of impending reversal. The moment finally arrived, though I had spent weeks ensuring it was precise, calculated, and impossible to ignore. He was in his office, pacing, as usual, surrounded by assistants who hung on his every word. I walked in with measured composure, carrying a folder that contained more than he could have anticipated. He glanced at me, a fleeting smirk tugging at his lips, assuming I was here with some trivial complaint or a routine request. "What is it now?" he asked, his tone casual, bordering on condescending. I smiled faintly, letting the silence stretch, letting him squirm just enough to reveal his habitual arrogance. "I've been thinking about the gala next week," I said slowly, placing the folder on his polished desk. "And I've decided we need to reconsider how it's being handled." He raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting me to suggest minor changes, adjustments he could brush aside. "Oh?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "Do tell. What are you planning?" I met his gaze steadily, letting him underestimate the weight behind my words. Inside, my pulse raced, but my exterior remained calm, deliberate, the image of composure he had never truly associated with me. "I've canceled the catering contract," I continued, watching as his smirk faltered, replaced by confusion, "and I've redirected the budget to a private charity initiative. It's already been arranged. I thought it was more meaningful than another party for show." His eyes narrowed slightly, disbelief flickering across his face. You did what?" he stammered, fumbling for control as he tried to mask the first signs of panic. The assistants shifted awkwardly, sensing the tension, but unsure how to intervene. Every second of silence heightened the suspense, and I could feel the subtle thrill of anticipation building within me. I allowed myself a small internal smile as he processed what had happened. He was used to the world bending to his whims, to everyone, including me, accepting his directives without question. But for the first time in years, he realized that I was not merely a shadow in the background. I was a presence capable of action, of disruption, and, if necessary, of humiliation. I could almost hear the internal gears turning, the recalculating of assumptions he had held for so long. You can't just decide things like that," he said finally, his voice tight, strained with the realization that he had misjudged me. I shrugged lightly, a gesture so casual it contrasted sharply with the weight of my action. "I thought it was overdue," I replied evenly, letting the calmness in my voice deepen the impact. "Some of us have been silent too long." His gaze darted briefly to the folder on his desk, and I knew he was scanning for evidence of incompetence, but all he found were meticulously organized documents, every move justified and calculated. The assistants avoided eye contact, the air heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that I had just shifted the dynamics in the room. He tried to assert authority, clearing his throat, issuing faintly clipped commands, but they rang hollow against the quiet power radiating from my measured presence. The first strike had been delivered, not with anger or dramatic theatrics, but with precision and restraint, an action that forced him to see me as more than he ever had. As I left the office, I caught a glimpse of his expression in the reflection, of the glass door, disbelief, frustration, and the faintest flicker of fear. It was intoxicating, a subtle yet undeniable victory that validated the months of careful observation, planning, and simmering anger. I returned to my guest room that night, the quiet space no longer feeling like exile. Each step toward the door had been a step toward reclaiming my autonomy, and for the first time in years, I felt the exhilarating pulse of power rising from beneath the ashes of my invisibility. The world had begun to shift, and he hadn't even seen the first wave coming. In the days that followed my first strike, I moved with the quiet precision of someone who had finally recognized the rules of the game and the pieces they had underestimated. I began consulting quietly with a trusted attorney, one who understood the nuances of high-profile divorces and the leverage hidden in financial minutiae. Every meeting, every document I examined, became a tool for empowerment, a way to convert years of silent endurance into tangible, undeniable influence. The legal strategies I explored were layered, subtle, and impossible for him to predict, designed to hit precisely where he would never anticipate. Simultaneously, I refined my social positioning. I attended charity events, gallery openings, and industry gatherings with quiet confidence, presenting myself as poised, intelligent, and independent. I didn't need to flaunt wealth. It was enough that my presence was deliberate, that conversations included my perspective for the first time without anyone realizing the long shadow he had cast over me. I observed his friends and allies, noting who might become sympathetic, who might unconsciously relay information, and who would overestimate their loyalty to him. Each encounter was a step in a delicate dance, one that demanded patience, subtlety, and the ability to remain invisible while quietly shifting the balance of power. Flashbacks continued to surface, vivid and sharp. I remembered the countless nights I had been ignored at his corporate events, the subtle dismissals that eroded my confidence, the times he had publicly minimized my contributions. I relived moments when I had gone above and beyond, quietly bailing him out of social faux pas, smoothing tensions with relatives, and ensuring that every gathering reflected his brilliance. Those memories were no longer burdens. They were evidence, proof of the meticulous patience I had cultivated, the groundwork that had gone unnoticed, but was now my arsenal. Internal monologue guided every action. I reminded myself to move slowly, to allow tension to build like a coiled spring. Each social interaction, each legal consultation, each minor maneuver was intentional. I was no longer reacting to his whims or enduring invisible humiliation. I was orchestrating a strategy that combined empathy, observation, and subtle manipulation. My mind repeatedly mapped outcomes, weighing risks and rewards, envisioning the moments when he would finally recognize that his assumptions about my passivity were catastrophically wrong. Despite all this, he remained oblivious. He carried on with his grand dinners, his public appearances, and his casual arrogance, unaware that I had begun to occupy a position of quiet influence. His laughter echoed through the halls. His compliments flowed freely to others, and I watched, learning, waiting. The tension grew steadily, a simmering undercurrent, because while he was blind to my growing control, the slightest misstep on his part could accelerate the reversal I had been planning for months. I also began to explore emotional leverage, small ways to remind him subtly that I was not the invisible wife he assumed I was. A carefully placed remark in conversation, a quiet suggestion to an influential associate, the faintest implication that I knew more than he believed. All of these served to undermine his assumptions without ever revealing my full hand. Each small action tightened the web, increasing both suspense and anticipation, and giving me a growing sense of mastery over a world that had once completely excluded me. By the end of these weeks, I felt the subtle thrill of control replacing years of invisibility. Every calculated move was a brushstroke in a larger masterpiece of reversal. He remained wrapped in his arrogance, unaware that the foundation he had built to assert dominance over me was beginning to crumble. I, in the quiet shadows of patience, was preparing the moment when all that would change, when years of underestimation would finally meet the consequence they deserved. I realized that no victory could be complete without understanding the network around him. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives who had unknowingly reinforced his arrogance. I began to observe them carefully, listening to whispered conversations at galas, noting who subtly admired me, who tolerated me, and who remained loyal to him without question. Some were innocents, oblivious to the tension simmering beneath the surface. Others were quietly influential, capable of tipping the scales if I played my hand wisely. I cataloged them all mentally, understanding that allies could be as valuable as leverage, and that secrets could become currency in the right moment. One afternoon, I met with a longtime friend who had been quietly sympathetic throughout my marriage. "You're smarter than they think," she said, her eyes sharp with both concern and curiosity. "They assume you'll stay invisible, that you'll follow the rules he set. But you're already moving in ways he can't predict." I nodded, letting her words reinforce what I already knew. Our conversation flowed naturally, revealing subtle insights about his social patterns and business dealings that even I hadn't fully realized. Every detail she offered was a piece of a puzzle I was slowly assembling, an invisible map of influence and opportunity. Meanwhile, interactions with minor family members and acquaintances revealed hidden tensions I could exploit. A cousin admitted offhandedly that he had always exaggerated stories to friends, embellishing my failures while downplaying his own. A colleague mentioned that he was careless with financial records, oblivious to the small details I had been quietly noting. Each revelation fed both my anticipation and my strategy. These secrets were fuel, little sparks that, when combined with patience and precision, could ignite a reversal far more satisfying than brute confrontation. Publicly, I remained underestimated. At charity luncheons and social events, he continued to command attention effortlessly, while I lingered at the edges, smiling, listening, and gently probing for information. The contrast was palpable. He was flamboyant, celebrated, and assured. I was quiet, subtle, and invisible. But beneath that veneer, a quiet storm was building. The tension between my public invisibility and my private empowerment created an undercurrent of suspense, one I knew would grip anyone who could see the story unfold. Dialogue became a weapon, as well as a tool for gathering intelligence. In hushed tones with trusted confidants, I subtly tested the boundaries of loyalty and influence. "Did you notice anything unusual at the meeting yesterday?" I asked one colleague, casually inserting myself into their narrative. Their offhand comment, a forgotten promise, a mismanaged event, a slight slight overlooked by him, added layers to my mental strategy. Every conversation became a building block, a thread I could weave into the larger web that would eventually unravel the illusion of control he had maintained for so long. By the end of these weeks, I had cultivated a small network of knowledge and subtle allies, people who could either actively support me or unknowingly create openings for my moves. The secrets I had uncovered and the influence I had quietly accumulated gave me a growing sense of mastery, of inevitability. Publicly, I remained underestimated, a silent observer in his world, but privately, I was the one holding the pieces of the puzzle. The tension between his visible power and my hidden preparation was palpable, and I relished the thought that the next stage, when these carefully nurtured secrets converged, would be explosive, both publicly and emotionally. The evening had all the trappings of one of his grand soirees: crystal chandeliers, a string quartet playing softly in the corner, and the subtle hum of the city's elite gathered in awe of his wealth and influence. I walked into the room deliberately, dressed simply yet with a quiet elegance that drew no attention, but demanded recognition from those who truly looked. He spotted me immediately, his smirk automatic, the expression of a man confident that I had no power in this world. He had underestimated me for years, and tonight, that arrogance would become the stage for my first public reversal. I moved through the crowd with a calmness that belied the storm beneath, greeting acquaintances with a polite nod, all the while letting the whispers of my arrival ripple through the room. He approached, thinking this would be another of our empty exchanges, a rehearsed dance of appearances. "You look nice," he said casually, the casualness of it almost mocking. I smiled faintly, letting a pause stretch just long enough to unsettle him. "Thank you," I replied, my voice even, deliberate. "But I've been thinking about how visible, or invisible, we truly are in the eyes of those around us." The conversation that followed was subtle but loaded, each sentence a calculated strike. I mentioned mutual acquaintances, hinting at insights he had never realized I had gathered. "I was surprised when I heard about the mismanaged event last month," I said casually to one of his colleagues nearby, ensuring he could hear. His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he tried to maintain composure. "Oh, minor oversight," he muttered, clearly caught off guard. I allowed a brief smile, letting him stew in the realization that I was fully aware of the patterns he had assumed I never noticed. Inside, my thoughts raced. Years of invisibility, of subtle humiliation, of being dismissed at every turn, had led to this precise moment. I recalled the countless dinners where my opinions were ignored, the board meetings where my ideas were stolen or discounted, and the private moments where he flaunted his superiority. The FOMO he had inflicted on me, leaving me out of decisions, events, and acknowledgments, had fueled my preparation. And now, the audience around us, both present and imagined, could sense the shift. The quiet, underestimated wife was no longer silent. As the evening progressed, I allowed the tension to build. Every comment, every glance, every subtle revelation was measured to maximize suspense. He tried to regain composure, to redirect the conversation, to assert dominance as he always had. But the seed of doubt had already been planted. Guests who had once admired his effortless control now sensed cracks, shifts, and the subtle empowerment radiating from me. He was caught in a moment he couldn't fully grasp, forced to realize that for years, he had miscalculated the depth of my awareness and the patience behind it. Then came the first major reversal, a carefully chosen disclosure. I mentioned a minor financial misstep he had overlooked, one that would seem trivial to him but catastrophic in its implications when framed correctly. "I thought it was important you knew that adjustments had already been made," I said, voice calm but firm. The assistants and colleagues nearby exchanged glances. He froze, realizing that his hidden vulnerabilities were now public, that I had turned knowledge and preparation into visible power. His smirk faltered completely, replaced by the faintest flicker of panic. The audience of onlookers, both in the room and those imagining the story unfolding, felt the suspense tighten. My first public strike had landed, shocking him and asserting that I was no longer passive, no longer invisible, and no longer underestimated. The careful tension, the buildup of years of neglect, and the subtle use of knowledge and patience converged into this moment, leaving him stunned while I reveled quietly in the undeniable shift of power. The revelation was not just my voice being heard, it was a declaration that the world he had built without me could no longer ignore my presence. Walked into his office with a deliberate calm that belied the storm surging beneath my skin. The lights reflected off the polished mahogany desk, and for a moment, I let the weight of the silence stretch, letting him sense the shift before I even spoke. He looked up, eyebrows raised, already assuming I was here for some minor request or social nicety. "What now?" he asked, a smirk tugging at his lips, the same arrogance I had endured for years. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. "It's time," I said softly, placing a crisp folder squarely on the desk between us. His eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me, confusion and disbelief warping his features. "Time for what?" he asked, though the hesitation in his voice betrayed him. I took a slow breath, letting each word land with precision. "Time for us to acknowledge the reality you've ignored for far too long. These are the divorce papers." For a heartbeat, the room was still. I watched him try to mask the shock, to summon control, but it slipped like sand through his fingers. "Divorce?" he stammered, leaning back as if the physical distance could shield him from the impact. "After everything? After the years we've had?" His voice wavered, betraying vulnerability he rarely showed, a crack in the mask of confidence he had worn so well. I could almost hear the disbelief echoing off the walls, magnified by the stunned silence of the few assistants and staff who had lingered near the doorway, sensing something monumental was unfolding. I leaned forward slightly, voice firm but calm, letting every syllable carry the weight of years of invisibility, suppression, and quiet suffering. After years of being unseen, unheard, and dismissed, I've realized that patience is not weakness. It's preparation, and now I am ready to reclaim my life, on my terms. My hands rested lightly on the folder, but the gesture was enough to signal finality. He swallowed, attempting to gather composure, yet the first tremors of fear had begun to ripple through him. As he stammered, trying to interject, I let my internal monologue unfold in fragments, unspoken but potent. All those nights I had endured his arrogance. All the moments I had suppressed my anger. The countless small humiliations he thought I would forget. They were here now, crystallized into action. This folder was more than paper. It was the accumulation of years of strategy, patience, and silent strength. I felt the years of emotional labor transform into power, tangible and undeniable, and I allowed myself a quiet thrill at the reversal unfolding before me. He attempted to assert himself, voice rising, trying to twist the situation into something negotiable. "You can't just—" he began, but I interrupted gently, letting the calm in my tone sharpen the impact. "I can, and I have. You underestimated me for too long, and I am no longer silent. You have had your stage, your parties, your wealth, and your visibility. Tonight, this ends on my terms." The assistants shifted uneasily, the weight of witnessing history in the making settling over the room. His arrogance faltered, and I could see the panic bloom behind his eyes, that rare vulnerability I had waited for. The moment stretched, each second intensifying the emotional charge. I recalled every slight, every laugh at my expense, every time I had been sidelined while he flaunted wealth or status. All of it, the humiliation, the FOMO, the relentless invisibility, had led to this. And now, with the papers between us, the balance had shifted irrevocably. I was no longer the wife in the shadows. I was the force he had ignored, underestimated, and dismissed. Finally, his shoulders slumped slightly, a faint acknowledgement of reality creeping into his expression. You've thought this through," he murmured, almost a whisper. I nodded, letting the finality of my decision settle in. Every step, every detail. I have waited, observed, and prepared. And now, the life I was promised, the life I deserve, begins. The subtle hum of awareness in the room, the assistants, the few family members who had lingered, added an additional layer of satisfaction. They saw him falter, the culmination of years of arrogance undone by the quiet, patient power of the person he had believed powerless. I picked up my bag, turning toward the door with a calmness that belied the storm of emotions inside me. Relief, exhilaration, vindication, all mingled together as I walked away, leaving him to process the public and personal weight of the reversal. The room still hummed with tension, the emotional release I had orchestrated resonating for everyone who had witnessed it. For the first time in years, I felt fully visible, fully heard, and fully in control. The divorce papers were not just a legal instrument. They were the ultimate declaration that the years of suppression, pain, and invisibility had ended, and I had emerged victorious. He sat at his desk, the divorce papers spread out like evidence of my patience and his misjudgment, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he attempted to regain composure. This isn't just sudden, is it?" he asked, voice tight, faltering under the weight of disbelief. I leaned against the edge of the desk, calm and deliberate, letting the contrast between us do the work he could no longer control. The man who once dominated every room with charisma and wealth now seemed small, uncertain, exposed in ways I had only imagined during years of quiet plotting. "I've been planning every step for months," I said evenly, watching his expression shift from shock to a flicker of anger, then frustration. "Every slight, every dismissal, every laugh at my expense has brought us to this moment. You assumed I would stay invisible forever, but assumptions are dangerous." He tried to interrupt, gesturing toward the papers, stammering over words that refused to form properly. I let him flounder, knowing that his attempts at control were futile. The room was no longer his stage. It was the arena where his arrogance met its match. My internal monologue replayed every humiliation I had endured. Dinners where he flaunted his charm, meetings where my insights were stolen, nights spent in isolation while he entertained colleagues and friends. Each memory fueled the satisfaction that surged quietly but powerfully within me. I had been underestimated for years, relegated to the shadows, yet now I stood fully visible, fully in control, every move precise, every word calculated to ensure he understood the depth of my empowerment. The contrast was stark, his confidence crumbling, mine consolidating into unshakable certainty. He lunged for explanations, words tumbling out in disjointed sentences. "You can't just, people will think this is..." Outrageous! I met his gaze calmly, letting the silence stretch, making him squirm under the weight of both his disbelief and the knowledge that I had orchestrated every element flawlessly. People already know who I am, I said softly, almost conversationally. But now, they will also see who I can be when I refuse to be invisible. You underestimated me, and that was your greatest mistake. The words landed like quiet thunder, shocking him in their precision. The assistants and a few family members lingered at the edges, sensing the tension and witnessing the reversal firsthand. Their hushed reactions only amplified the impact, the subtle FOMO rippling through the social hierarchy he had so carefully cultivated. Every glance, every suppressed gasp, every whisper validated the meticulous work I had done, the slow burn of years culminating in a moment of undeniable moral and emotional victory. His public stature had once dwarfed me. Now his silence, his faltering words, and the visible falter of his ego showcased the new reality. The wife he dismissed had become the orchestrator of control. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile, savoring the internal rush of vindication. My patience, observation, and strategic actions had coalesced into a second, more profound power reversal. Not only had I asserted independence through legal means, but I had also demonstrated mastery over the social and emotional terrain he had assumed was entirely his. Every subtle glance he cast at me, every failed attempt to regain dominance, reinforced the satisfaction of watching the once powerful husband become vulnerable, humbled by the consequences of his own underestimation. "Do you understand now?" I asked gently, letting the question hang in the room. His lips parted, no coherent answer forming, only a faint nod and a visible shiver of acknowledgement. I could almost feel the culmination of years of quiet endurance and calculated planning crystallize in that moment, the ultimate satisfaction of watching injustice corrected, arrogance humbled, and my own empowerment fully realized. As I turned to leave, each step deliberate, I knew the audience of witnesses, both real and imagined, had absorbed the full force of the reversal. The shock, the awe, and the moral victory were complete. For the first time in years, the narrative had shifted entirely. I was no longer sidelined, no longer underestimated, and no longer invisible. The balance of power had changed irrevocably, and the thrill of ultimate satisfaction lingered like an electric charge, marking the culmination of patience, strategy, and long-denied vindication. The house felt different the next morning, quieter, emptier, yet charged with a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. I walked through rooms that had once symbolized invisibility and suppression, noticing how the air seemed to shift now that the weight of his presence had been diminished. I paused at the living room, recalling the countless times I had sat on that sofa, listening to his laughter echo over parties I had quietly endured, my voice never heard, my opinions dismissed. The contrast between then and now struck me deeply. I had transformed from someone who survived in shadows to someone fully present, fully empowered. Flashbacks surfaced, sharp and vivid. I remembered nights spent lying awake in the guest room, the sting of FOMO as I imagined his glamorous events while I remained sidelined. I recalled subtle humiliations at board meetings, the polite smiles masking invisible suffering, and the quiet, patient endurance I had cultivated. Each memory now felt like a stepping stone rather than a wound, a record of resilience and strategic planning that had carried me to this moment of personal sovereignty. The pain remained, but it was now reframed as fuel that had powered my ascent. As I sipped coffee, I reflected on the consequences of my actions. The divorce papers, the public reversals, the calculated maneuvers. They had shifted not only the balance of power between us, but also the way I perceived myself. I was no longer defined by his dismissal, by the roles he assigned or the visibility he controlled. I was defined by my choices, my preparation, and my ability to act decisively when the moment demanded it. Moral vindication wasn't just a concept anymore. It was tangible, residing in the air I breathed, in the quiet smiles exchanged with allies, and in the subtle awe that lingered from those who had witnessed the reversal. FOMO lingered, but now it was inverted. I felt it not as exclusion, but as an acute awareness of the life I had once been denied, the recognition I had once craved, and the freedom that now belonged entirely to me. The audience, whether real or imagined, could sense the contrast. He had flaunted wealth, attention, and control while I remained sidelined, yet I had ultimately claimed the narrative. Every glance backward, every whisper, every surprised reaction was evidence of my triumph. Empathy surged as I recalled viewers like me, those silenced, overlooked, or dismissed, seeing themselves reflected in my journey from suppression to self-assurance. I thought about the friendships, allies and confidants who had guided me, who had shared insights and quietly bolstered my strategy. Their support had been invaluable, reminding me that even in isolation, connection could fuel resilience and amplify power. I felt gratitude, but it was mingled with a profound sense of autonomy. I had acted decisively, and the outcome had been entirely of my own making. No longer invisible, no longer underestimated, I could step forward into a life that was fully mine. By the time the evening arrived, I felt a steady, unshakable calm. The emotional roller coaster of humiliation, plotting, and confrontation had given way to clarity and peace. I knew the path ahead was mine to define, unbound by the constraints he had imposed or the expectations of society. Freedom was no longer abstract. It was a lived reality, marked by the lessons of endurance, strategy, and patience. Moral vindication and personal growth intertwined seamlessly, leaving me both relieved and exhilarated. I closed my eyes briefly, breathing in the quiet triumph, knowing that the story of invisibility had ended, and that my narrative had finally been written on my own terms. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new apartment, glinting off the minimalist furnishings I had chosen for myself, each piece a reflection of independence and taste rather than someone else's whim. I moved through the space with a sense of ease I hadn't felt in years, sipping coffee as I scrolled through messages from friends who had been silently rooting for me all along. Their congratulations, casual updates, and shared laughter reminded me that life could be vibrant, fulfilling, and entirely my own. No longer overshadowed, no longer silenced, I felt the subtle thrill of autonomy coursing through every routine. I met a close friend for lunch at a quiet, elegant cafe downtown. "I can't believe how much has changed," she said, eyes wide with genuine admiration. "You're glowing and so confident. It suits you." I smiled, letting the compliment settle comfortably. "It's more than confidence," I replied, voice steady. "It's freedom. For the first time, I get to make choices for myself, without anyone else's approval or arrogance dictating my life." We laughed easily, sharing small updates about work, travel, and mutual friends, and I realized how rare it was to experience conversation where I was both heard and respected, a stark contrast to the years of being invisible in the shadows of his world. Social media offered another layer of subtle satisfaction. Photos of my travels, glimpses of projects I had taken on, and carefully curated updates reflected a life thriving on independence rather than status flaunting. Occasionally, I noticed his name mentioned, always in past tense, irrelevant to the conversation swirling around my achievements. The contrast was undeniable. Where he had once been the center of attention, now his presence felt diminished, peripheral, almost quaint. I allowed myself a small, private smile at the thought of his realization, how the arrogance that had once overshadowed me had become irrelevant in the world I had quietly built. Luxury no longer felt like ostentation. It felt like choice. I had worked to cultivate an environment that reflected my values, tastes, and independence, and every detail, furniture, art, even the smallest personal touches, was a reminder that I had reclaimed ownership of my life. The once overbearing husband, who had measured success by wealth and control, was now absent from the narrative I lived each day. His shadow, once looming over every social engagement and decision, had faded, leaving space for authenticity, for empowerment, and for joy. Evenings were filled with friends, laughter, and the soft hum of gatherings where I was both seen and celebrated for who I was, rather than who I had been forced to be. Conversations flowed without the underlying tension of power imbalance, and I reveled in the simple pleasure of being treated as a person of influence, intelligence, and warmth. Every toast, every compliment, every moment of shared amusement reinforced the contrast between my flourishing existence and the diminished presence of the man who had once dictated my life. As I prepared for the night ahead, reviewing plans for a charity event I was organizing independently, I reflected on how far I had come. The journey from shadows to empowerment, from invisibility to recognition, had been deliberate, calculated, and deeply satisfying. I felt the weight of moral vindication and personal triumph settle into a quiet, unshakable joy. My new life was more than survival. It was thriving, confident, and wholly mine. The past, the struggles, the humiliations, they all belonged to the chapters I had closed. Ahead was a world of possibility, autonomy, and respect, and I was ready to live it fully, unapologetically, and triumphantly. Sitting quietly in the early morning light, I allowed myself a rare moment of introspection. The journey from being invisible to empowered had been long, arduous, and layered with both pain and revelation. I thought about the years I had endured, silent dinners, overlooked achievements, and the subtle, constant erosion of confidence under the weight of his arrogance. Every humiliation, every slight had felt unbearable at the time, but now, in hindsight, I recognized that they were the foundation upon which I had built my strength. The suffering had been real, yet it had also been instructive, teaching me patience, observation, and the art of measured action. Empathy filled me as I remembered those moments of doubt and loneliness. Moments when I had questioned my worth or imagined that escape was impossible. I understood, acutely, why others in similar situations might feel trapped, invisible, or undervalued. And I hoped that my story, this narrative of quiet endurance, calculated strategy, and eventual empowerment, might serve as both validation and inspiration. The audience, those who had lived through neglect, favoritism, or dismissal, could see themselves reflected in my journey, and perhaps feel a sense of possibility for their own liberation. Yet the reflection was not without its bittersweet edges. Gaining autonomy and moral vindication had a cost. Relationships had shifted, trust had been tested, and the luxury of finally being fully seen had required years of careful observation, planning, and emotional restraint. I acknowledged that empowerment is never free. It demands sacrifice, strategic patience, and courage. The lessons learned were hard-earned yet deeply resonant, leaving me with a quiet satisfaction that went beyond revenge or legal victory. It was a personal reckoning, a reclamation of identity and dignity. I also considered the contrasts that had defined my path. Invisibility versus recognition, submission versus assertion, neglect versus respect. Each extreme had sharpened my understanding of myself and the world around me. The tension between past suffering and present triumph was no longer a source of bitterness, but a testament to resilience and foresight. I had not merely reacted to injustice. I had transformed it into empowerment, turning every overlooked moment into evidence of my eventual ascendancy. The moral closure was clear. He had been confronted, humbled, and rendered irrelevant in the spheres where he once wielded dominance. Yet my reflection was not steeped in triumphalism. It was tempered by awareness that justice, when patiently executed, carries both satisfaction and gravity. I had gained more than legal victories or social recognition. I had reclaimed my agency, my voice, and the right to shape my own life story. That reclamation, deeply personal and profoundly transformative, was the ultimate moral vindication. Finally, I allowed myself to envision the future, one shaped entirely by choice, intention, and autonomy. Freedom was no longer abstract. It was tangible in daily decisions, social interactions, and personal pursuits. I carried the lessons of endurance, strategy, and self-respect forward, understanding that life's complexity requires both courage and clarity. The audience, having witnessed the arc of my journey, could feel the resolution, the emotional catharsis, the empowerment, and the satisfaction of witnessing justice served. In that quiet moment of reflection, I understood the truth. Growth comes with cost. Empowerment requires patience. And moral vindication is sweetest when earned deliberately. The story had reached its close, but its resonance, the reminder that resilience, intelligence, and courage can overturn even the most entrenched neglect, would linger. I was no longer defined by past suppression. I was defined by choice, strength, and the life I had courageously claimed.